As a representative of Augsburg's Convocation Committee, I take great pleasure in introducing today's speaker. A 1965 graduate of Augsburg College, our guest also holds a Master of Fine Arts degree from the University of Arkansas. Currently on the faculty at Luther College, Decorah, Iowa, she teaches English and plies the difficult trade of poet. And with some success, I might add. Her poetry has been published in such magazines as Christian Century, College English, and Crescent Magazine. Recently, she's completed a book of poems entitled Pulpit Rock. A rather ambiguous title, I might add. Our speaker just returned from New York City and a meeting of the Inter-Lutheran Commission on Worship, a group of which she is a member. She comes today to share with us her perceptive thoughts about Christian liberal arts education. Thank you for coming, Gracia Grindal, and welcome back to Augsburg College.
Thank you very much. It's a great privilege to be here, though it is clear to me that I am simply too young to be doing this. But as you count up the years, it's not really quite so young. It is a mere 10 years since I graduated and a mere 15 since I arrived on this campus to listen to people at least as old as I am now speak of things from what I assume to be the far distant past. It is a sobering thought to realize that that was when the present Frosh were 3 years old. And now here I stand. I cannot do otherwise than to reach back into those days and reach forward into yours and affirm a special kind of goodness that we hold together here in this place and in this set of words that we call Augsburg College. As a graduate of this school and a teacher at another Christian liberal arts college, I have done much thinking about what it is that makes the matter so much to all of us. What it is about Augsburg and this group of people that has made people live in states of almost unimaginable deprivation these days, simply so that this place could survive. And what exactly is it that makes this place very special to me and to my people? It is words that hold communities together, and there is, I think, a particularly rich set of words that knits this community. It is an easy thing to find those words much spoken wherever 2 or 3 Augsburg students are gathered together, and those words, I have good evidence, are not just words stamped on the logo of the college, nor are they simply canned phrases with no significance in the lives of those who live close to this institution. I have found those words and will continue to find those words more important to me as I live my life, and I hope that others do and will also. It is very important to me that people do. I shall try to be easy and cool about them today, thinking as the words go on of a story told by me by a fellow Augsburg graduate who is a pastor now at assistant campus minister at Luther College, who reported that he had been to a prayer meeting on the campus, and a girl had begun praying, Dear Jesus, it's dear Jesus, it's just so easy to talk to you. That's a Harley Refsall story. Every community needs to talk about itself to find out who it is, and in much the same way that we as individuals must talk about ourselves to find out who we are and what we'd like to be. Communities have always needed, ever since they have begun, bards and laureates to remember and tell the stories of the tribe. This community, of course, is no exception, and I think we have an unusually rich set of anecdotes about ourselves and our heroes and our heroines. They are stories which reveal in many ways things that make this place unique, its attitudes towards itself and the people it values and holds up as examples. And they are the stories that have determined and defined much of my life. I think I am safe in saying that I was raised in the home of two of those bards. They can tell stories. These stories, however, are centered around some words, those words I was speaking of, and I'll sort of try to weave them together maybe with less than more skill, but I'd like to just talk a little bit and use some of those words. I think that the word freedom is one of those words, and I think truth and grace are also two of those words, and a word that is not much used but that I have begun to appreciate after being out in this world of people who do not use the English language with any pleasure, that the Augsburg College tradition is one of great eloquence. And all we have to do is think back to realize that. And these stories are, of course, centered on some fine people. Now, freedom is a word that I am not going to define as I think of it, but we all know that it is a word that has two completely different definitions, and they are based on several different understandings of what it means to be a human being. Some think that freedom comes when men and women are no longer bound by rules that are oppressive or conventions that are dull, and that they are free when they can do whatever they please and are free to move about as they will and say what they will, and that is important. And I affirm that freedom to not be oppressed by a government or by a hierarchy or by a group into being something I would rather not be. Others, more in line with, I suppose, the theology of St. Paul, would conceive of freedom as something which has no or little reference to the exterior, but has much to do with the mind and the spirit. One thinks of the scene in Dr. Zhivago where the prisoner on the train going to Siberia rattles his chains and claims that he cannot be bound, for his mind is free. And such freedom I also wholeheartedly support. But when my parents put me on a train in Portland, Oregon, and said I was going to Augsburg College to learn not to be strangers to them and to learn how the truth would make me free, I must confess not feeling terribly free. I could not even, while crossing the Great Plains of Montana, raise my chains and announce that I was free in my head. Even if I was, I thought, at that time free, I was going to a place that would make me horror of horrors, just like them. That's what they kept saying. Talk about chains for a while. Of course, we have that great problem in America, the business of being free and strange and committed and feeling very much at home. There's a wonderful story I must tell you, told to me by my mother only a few years ago. I was rather unpleasant about this trip, I must say. And I raised something of a ruckus about the coming train trip. And Mother had written to Ann Peterson, whom some of you know, and those of you who don't should listen to stories about her. She's one of the saints. My mother had written, since she'd been her secretary when she was a student here, and asked her if Augsburg was good enough for Gracia. And Miss Peterson wrote back in her inimitable style, saying that the question was, rather, Jonette, is Gracia good enough for Augsburg? Now, that's an important story, because her answer had not only to do with SAT scores, which is something that we were big on then, and very competitive. We were the Sputnik generation. We were coming to save the Americans from the Russians. That answer has to do with the quality of a person. It is an astonishing way to think of college admissions, but it rings loudly and clearly with the keen sense of integrity that runs through many of the stories about the people at this place. And it is that sense of integrity, frivolously illustrated here, that becomes more and more important to me as I think of what it means to be free. It is a bracing thing to think how steadfastly and how deeply the founders of this college and those who followed after have insisted that it is only through truth that one can be free, that one can unblinkingly and steadily view what is, and must do that, and yet find in that vision, in the understanding of the gospel, the freedom to be. It is astonishing, and it is something that you must value and treasure and keep in your stories, as I do. One of the things, too, about this, I think about what it means to be free, is also to have a strong sense of humor about yourself. And I think some of the stories at Augsburg are very, very much making fun of them as they have tried to be serious. This is not particularly an Augsburg story, but it strikes me as to the point, and once again, I suppose, frivolous. There was a man who called the ALC youth department and was very distressed about what they were doing, and he said, "If Jesus knew the truth about what they were doing with the youth in the Lutheran church, he would turn over in his grave." It seems more and more certain to me as I consider what my tradition is, and I suppose someone who is a poet, who always writes from a tradition. You cannot create something out of thin air. You have to write on the stories and on the images that are given you. That I also think that we must know words like authentic. We must understand those sorts of words. The person who would be free, as I've said before, must know who he or she is. And those stories that I have told, some of them, ring with a sort of sense that we cannot be pretentious. We must know who we are. There are many stories also in this tradition about the saints. And in Decorah, I have a very funny sort of mythology. I call Minneapolis the Holy City. And I call my people who have gone to their eternal reward the saints. And some of us maybe are saints also. But one of the things that is very clear to me, not only that sense of humor, the stories that people tell, the rollicking sense of humor about ourselves, which seems to me to be very healthy, there's also that sense in the tradition that there's, and this goes all the way back to Georg Sverdrup, the sense that one never is too important, too smart, to find a person to go out and talk to the people in the farms and in the small towns and in the tiny congregations and in small and wonderful little places where people appreciate that. And that is another kind of freedom that I enjoy and I value very much. I think of my awe and wonder to realize that as a 13-year-old kid at Lutheran Bible Camp in Tacoma, Washington, I had a long talk with Bernhard Christensen about the crisis in Lebanon and realized, as I had not realized it before, that he was a Democrat. But he had the love and concern and interest to try to convert me. No, it's an astonishing thing to remember and to realize that he took what I had to say about that crisis in 1957 and listened to me and talked to me about it. Some of those things you will never forget. And I found that freedom when I came to Augsburg. I discovered what it meant to be connected and to know who I was. And it is the thing that I treasure most about this place.
Now, in that sense of learning that sense of freedom, coming onto the campus and finding out that rhetoric really does apply in the lives of people
is shocking. But understanding also the deep and strong commitment to the things of this world as well as the next began to really work on me. We talked about education for service, and that's very important also. I remember when I was a sophomore here in chapel, standing at this very place, Bernhard Christensen spoke about service. And I was going to apply for a job that day. And I walked out into the car and said to my dad, "Take me to Ebenezer." And he said, "All right." So I went and applied for a job and got this job working for 95 cents an hour because it was a Christian home. But that very directly put me into training for a job that I was to get later and that I'd like to talk a little bit more about in the context of the Christian Liberal Arts College. When I graduated from Augsburg then, I had worked at Ebenezer for 3 years and had learned how to be a servant and went to Norway with the Augsburg choir and decided to stay there. And because of that training, I got a job in an old people's home in Norway, in Oslo, washing floors. And I remember it may not be the sort of thing I had trained for, as all first jobs are very seldom the jobs you had trained for. And I've thought about that and what my education at Augsburg had caused me to be able to do and to see while I was over there. And I'm thinking of what Phil Kleinbeck said last year at the Lutheran Faculties Conference, that there must be something more distinctive about a liberal arts graduate than the fact that they cannot get a job. Well, I found what it means to be human, what it means to be engaged in the real world. And I learned that there's more to the life of a human being than mere subsistence. When I was washing these floors and these old men, I worked on a men's ward. When I was doing this, I found out what it meant to be truly educated. I can't remember what I was thinking about as far as possible career choices were concerned that spring morning a year before at 4 a.m. when I was listening to the last record of the play King Lear. I do know that I can still feel the wall against my back in Miriam House, which is now no longer, and feel the ripcord of my blue dorm bedspread as I heard the old man King Lear come to his senses. That was a marvelous, thrilling, changing experience. But I didn't know how much it was a part of me, even after I had been through the class with Miss Peterson, who was always asking me, how can you talk about these plays when you haven't read them carefully? But I didn't know how much a part of me that play had become until I started working in this old people's home in Oslo. And an old bear of a man slugged me very hard and told me to leave him alone in his dreams. I understood something right away, but what I was not sure. It was only a few weeks later, after I had heard him walking, stormy-eyed and crying through the halls, beating his powerful fist against the tables in angry search of a daughter that the others assured me was dead, that I recognized where I had heard him before. I had heard this voice through a very ineffective wind machine on a record that previous spring when I had been cramming for the Shakespeare test. Then the old man took on, in my eyes, a grandeur not even he could guess at. All that year I could think of nothing but Lear every time old Christiansen would go mad. I learned from another aide, one of my favorite people, Bergljot, how to wash his socks and sweaters, how to put a diaper on him, how to keep him clean. His was a life at its most elemental and basic. One of my favorite memories of him is the time I was supposed to bathe him. It had been 3 weeks since his last bath, floors being a bit more important there than people. And once during that 3 weeks, a revivalist came, and that was during the bath time for that floor. So we didn't get the men washed that week. So it was 6 weeks before we got them washed. So it was a fairly important and urgent affair when we finally got them toward the tub. And I got this old man strapped into the dolly that was supposed to lift patients and was just beginning to raise him into the tub when the whole contraption fell down with him in it, and he was somewhat rudely dumped on the cold tile floor. He was as mad as I had ever seen him. He got up slowly and started lumbering toward me with murder on his mind. My liberal arts education, however, served me well. I ran down the hall and hid behind a door. As he moved down the hall, I saw in his angry pink shape the shape of a statue in Vigeland Park, some few blocks from where I worked. And that is a park full of statues from the 7 ages of men and women, and he looked like the Saint Aguta. Many were the evenings I could go to that park and stand there touching the huge red stones, men and women as old and as marvelous as the old people that I washed and fed during the day, and I sensed there was a truth in those stones. Christiansen had no family left. There was no trace about him of what he had done or those he had loved. He was an abandoned old man, which is probably why he wept so bitterly that his daughter was dead. He had most likely been a kindly laborer, doing jobs of the kind I was doing at the time. I am sure he was a man of courage and a just man, and I respected his dreams and did not waken him from them, for they were by all odds his most pleasant place. And I knew that he would not, as Lear had, come to his senses The only thing that would waken him would have been a new body, one in which he could live a vigorous and active life again, working every day. So I did not want to waken him to a world with which he could not cope, in fact had not coped, and left him on the sofa dreaming. Next to Christiansen in the wards, there was an old man who simply did not have enough time to finish all of the things that he wanted to do. His life was as full of the present as Christiansen's was of the past. Enholm was his name, and he would get up early every morning to read some book before the breakfast bell. And above his bed were several paintings that he had tried to paint by number during his life, and he was always fussing at the hands of the portrait of a woman he thought was very much like his wife. He could never get them quite right. During the day, he would play the organ in the lobby and work and fuss at some harmonization he wanted to do of an old chorale or old folk tune he had heard when he was a child. Sometimes he wrote poems to go with the music, which were, of course, awful, and he would talk about them with me. His life was crowded with good things. I haven't the slightest idea what his profession was either, as one seldom does in the old people's homes where I have been. But I do know that he lived the life of the mind his whole life and engaged that life of the mind in the, quote, real world, unquote. And even though his body was in much worse shape than his neighbors, Christiansen, he was a dignified survivor. And I smile to myself when I think of what he would say if some aide in the home would try to involve him in a craft activity when he had been reading. I use these two men as extreme examples. These two men had aged into something I think it is clear they chose to when they were very young. I don't want to argue about all the causes of senility. My sister Lorraine has done considerable research on this topic, and the scientists, I'm told lately, have decided that something like half of the cases of senility are really cases of mental illness, people unable to cope with their loss of significance when they retire, and they can no longer work, and their bodies are no longer as supple and agile as ours. I suppose it sounds as though I'm saying a fairly silly thing. The liberal arts education you are getting will help you when time hangs heavy for you in the old people's home. Sort of, but it's not that simple. Otherwise, we could skip educating the youth and get down to business right now over at Ebenezer. But alas, it is not so easy. You cannot get good cheese if you do not have much time. The proof of your life is not whether you can get a fantastic job when you graduate. The proof will be what your head is full of when you retire or are moved into your last place. What they move in with you will be an indication to everyone what sort of choices you have made when you were young. If you have, while you were here, taken a broad range of courses and had broad interests, so you have not limited yourself when you graduate, you will be able to do almost anything. The professions will need you and your broad range of knowledge. The country most certainly needs you. But you are not, if you will pardon the metaphor, a finished product when you walk off this stage at graduation with your diploma. It is then for you to grow. I cannot but think of the story of the talents. Some people increase their worth by doubles. Then there are those who hoard and bury their talent in a tight little lit of gold and keep it. The world is full of graduates, college graduates, who have not lived life any differently from what they would have without their education. And they are our failures, but most of all, their own. Lest you think I'm speaking of some sort of aristocracy of the intellect and saying that people who think are better than those who don't. It is not quite that. It is a truism that to think is to be full of sorrow. I am rather giving you two lives that I loved very much, but you should not doubt who I would rather be when I am 90. The life of the mind engaged in the real world is a richness. And if one attends sensibly to the health of the body and enjoys it, the mind can be active and involved long after we are confined to a small room. I said at the beginning that what I care about and what most matters to me is a place like Augsburg College because of its emphasis on the Christian liberal arts tradition. So far I have spoken of the mind. It is deliberately that I first have affirmed the value of the life of the mind, for it is through the mind that I have become much more able to affirm the value and worth of life. In the face of death, we are all commoners. To be Christian is to understand one's involvement with others. It is to be aware of one's dependence, one needs for grace. We are all equal. There are no special places in church, no special people, and that is very deeply burned into me out of my tradition here. We are all equal. Jesus died for us all, not only the simple folk, or not only the intellectuals. And that understanding is cause for quiet joy and humility. Christian communities live in forgiveness of each other because they are aware of how they fail. We cannot stop hurting each other, but we can learn to ask each other for forgiveness. And intellectual communities especially need to be kept aware as they move into increasing worlds of abstraction that human life is whole. One must remember that the intellectual community and the Christian community lives in a tension at Augsburg College and at Luther College, all of the colleges like that, in a tension which is creative and life-giving. The moment any thinker is tempted to rise above the people and scorn them, to recognize no human bond or rule, we have a value system which pulls that person back. We have only to remember that God spoke to us not in power, but in humility. He became what we are and consecrated our human lives. He died because we could not stand the wholeness of his life and his vision. And in like manner, our minds have to do with our faith if it is to be whole. A faith that thinks the mind is some sort of block between us and God separates the wholeness of human life as much as does a reason that denies feeling. It seemed to me that at Augsburg I learned that life should be lived at the center of the crosshairs, in the tension between memory and hope, of eminence and transcendence, of what one ought and what one can, in the poignancy of the moment. We should learn to eat, drink, and be merry with a good conscience, as Oscar Anderson said in a terrible time when my sister was graduating from Augsburg. And it seems to me that one understands the poignancy of the moment especially well in a place where people love to talk and do it well. I remember especially William Halverson's, the philosophy teacher when I was here, moment the day that John Kennedy died and we instantly gathered here. And he knew, because of who he was and where he'd come from and the audience, the right thing to say. I will never forget. I think that is the most amazing moment of my life here. He began reading, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord." Let me finish the story about Christiansen and Enholm. There was a terrible head nurse at that home. She was an alcoholic and quite incapable of administrating her duties. By December of that year, we spent a good share of our time protecting the patients from her. One evening, I found her squeezing the bowels of a man with staph infection so bad, no hospital in Oslo would have him. Then one night, I held the violent body of a man while she gave him a shot that I am sure killed him. Finally, I got my American dander up and complained. I organized the aides and wrote complaints against the lady, did all sorts of legal work in my broken Norwegian. Just before she was fired, we all left the home because it was just too difficult to continue working. When she was fired, we stood outside the home rejoicing in our victory. I remember feeling fairly smug about that. 6 months later, my friend wrote that Enholm had finally gotten transferred to the home where she was working, and that he had told her how things had gone from bad to worse. After we left, and the head nurse left, there was no help at all. The old people simply lay in their messes day after day. When someone bothered to turn Christensen one day, he was dead. The aide said he had begun to stink of death. And so did my victory. It was hollow. It was rotten with perfection, as Kenneth Burke would say. The nurse had become my enemy, and I had thought that if she were gotten rid of, everything would be all right. I don't feel as guilty about that as I do silly. I should have known better, I suppose. Final solutions, simple solutions, seem always to breed thousands of evils where there had only been one. We are so fallible and silly and so much in need of grace. And I learned that here too. I would like to end this speech with a tribute to a woman who, it seems to me, exemplifies so much of what Augsburg was and is and can be, Gerda Mortensen. This is the first freshman class this year who will not get to know her, and she was very eager always to do that. I grieve for that, but she is still here among us in our stories, and it is our duty to keep telling those stories. She was amazing. I was a student the year she retired as Dean of Women, and went to many, many farewell banquets for Gerda. We began saying, I always enjoy the Gerda Mortensen farewell banquets. Few people I have ever known have burst with such energy and such zest for life. She was incredible. One of my favorite moments with her at one of those banquets, I think it was a Mission Society farewell, and she got up and was talking about all the people she had known, which went on for some time. And she said that she was talking about the Helen family, and she said how old man Helen had said that because he had had missionary sons in Madagascar, India, and Japan, and China, that the sun never set on the Helen family. That goes way back. But the most wonderful part about that was that Melvin Helen was there, and he stood up and he said, in his very dry way, he said, Dad said that that was because God didn't trust the Helen family in the dark. We've got to keep those stories. Gerda made the Student Affairs Office at Augsburg one of the most important offices at Augsburg. People who go to other places and compare it are amazed at how important the student is at Augsburg. And that is, if anything at all, the legacy of Gerda Mortensen. I was talking to Julie Goodmistad Thompson in New York City the other night, and she was the one who made this observation. I have two moments of her life that are particularly close to me in particular, just to show you how she related to me. And it's sort of hard to say just a little about a woman who began a recommendation of me. I knew Gracia's great-grandparents very well. 3 years ago, when she was just getting started in the push for the Norwegian sesquicentennial, a celebration for which she is almost entirely responsible, and you must remember that as you go hither and yon the next month to see King Olav and all of his retinue and everything else. She came to Decorah for Nordic Fest and stopped at my house. Everything interested her, but this time she wanted to read my poems, which I was really surprised by. She sat in my easy chair and read slowly and carefully a poem I had written on the death of Georg Sverdrup in 1907. She read it out loud slowly, put the manuscript down, and said, "Yes, that is the way it was. I was there." I must say I felt a deep, strong connection with the past when she began to tell then more stories about that day, and that my great-grandfather had been there.
She was passing something on to me, and Gerda knew she was passing something on to me. She was telling me these stories, and she made it quite clear that I was responsible for keeping them and passing them on too when the time came in my life. There's another time, one I am much moved by. It happened a year ago when the Lutheran faculties held their conference at Augsburg College, and I came off. As I looked around at the women in the room, of which there were only a few, of course, it was clear to me that we were mostly Gerda's girls. It is hard, perhaps, for those of you who know Augsburg best of all the Lutheran schools, to understand how amazing it really is that women students from 1923 at Augsburg College have had role models of such marvelous women as Gerda Mortensen. Her career opened up thousands of possibilities for us, and we are much grateful for that. We have possibilities that our friends from other colleges sometimes are only now beginning to realize. It never occurred to me that I could not do what I wanted to do. Her career is a great one for us to follow. We have had many others. We've had Ann Peterson, and Mildred Joel, Mimi Kingsley, Mrs. Sibley. All of those women were here when I was here, when it was very hard for women students to feel across the country that women were to do anything but to marry and have children. We knew that was not the only option because of these women here. We were being taught Freud, and it was a terrible struggle for us. But my generation of students at Augsburg saw these women living good lives, and we wanted to emulate them. There was a goodly number of us at this conference. In the late afternoon, Gerda came in, weak and much thinner than I had ever seen her. She sat down beside me, and I was shocked to see her so much changed. She had seemed so changeless all of my life. After the meeting, she took my arm, and we walked to the cafeteria elevator and went down to main floor. As we walked out, she asked, as she would, to meet my colleagues, and she did, shaking her head and commenting that I still moved my arms too much when I talked. And then she left. That was the last time I saw her. I came up for her funeral. We celebrated her with words, eloquent words, and good stories of the lady's rich, full life. Her life affirms all that is good about Augsburg College. It makes us better than we are. She had a keen sense of who she was. She knew she was a pastor's daughter, and she knew that the congregation was the right form of the kingdom of God on earth. She lived rejoicing in the riches of God's grace, and if there ever was a free woman, she was that. There are not many like her. There have not been many like her. But I imagine now that heaven has many feasts since she arrived. Because of her joy in life, her love of this place, I can say to you it is time that you seize the day here. You may not be here long, but if you use this place and these people are right, they will be with you long. There is a fullness here, a richness that is yours for the taking. Because of her example and many others like her, perhaps some nurse's aide as yet unborn will close your eyes and fold your arms and say, here was a woman, here was a man who burst with the fullness of life, whose mind and heart were fused in a unity of thoughtfulness and great love. And I commend to you that ripeness, the ripeness of this woman who could not lose her life enough for this place, who gave all that she had away and found at the end of life that she was rich.